everyone, welcome. My name is Marion Fourcade and I am the Director of Social Science Matrix at UC Berkeley. I am delighted to welcome you to our panel today, Disaster and Displacement, Inequalities in Climate Migration. This event is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, the Center for Effective Global Action, and the Human Rights Center. On our end, this event is part of our Matrix On Point series, panel discussions on important matters of the moment. Because today's event is our last this semester, I actually want to use this opportunity to thank the people behind the scenes who have been instrumental in putting together a series of wonderful events this year. Jessica Stewart, Matrix Associate Director, and Charles Kapelke, our Communications Director. For the spring semester, we are working on 4 Matrix On Point events: pandemic lessons, educational inequalities in the wake of COVID-19, the American pursuit of racial justice, truth and denial, disinformation and the changing media landscape, and the future of money, cryptocurrency and the cashless economy. We will also have a distinguished Matrix lecture by Danielle Allen and a series of book talks, beginning with talks on books by Steven Weber and Jovan Lewis, both faculty members at UC Berkeley. And now let me turn to the moderator of today's panel. Irene Bloomrad is Professor of Sociology and the Thomas Gordon Barnes Chair of Canadian Studies at UC Berkeley. She is also the founding director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, a co-sponsor of this event. Bloomrad holds the position of Senior Fellow with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and in 2014-2015, she served as a member of the US National Academies of Sciences Committee, reporting on the integration of immigrants into American society. Her research stands at the intersection of immigration studies and political sociology with a strong interdisciplinary and international scope. She is the author of Becoming a Citizen, published in 2006, and the co-editor of 4 books on citizenship and immigrant rights. So without further ado, Irene, this is your moment.
No, it's going to be our panelist moment is what it's really going to be. Thank you very much, Marion. I just want to welcome everybody and thank everyone for joining us here at the end of a long academic semester. For those of you who have been teaching, it's been a challenging semester, and probably even more for those students who are joining us. I imagine it's also been an extremely challenging semester in terms of our new online climate. So we're really, really glad that you have taken the time on this Friday for this really important panel. Now, clearly climate change is an issue of critical importance, really getting to the challenge of life on Earth for humans, but also for all living species. And then we're joining it with this thorny issue of migration. I actually taught this past semester a course with a colleague here at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Sarah Song, on normative and empirical approaches to citizenship and migration. And one of the questions we tackled was the issue of justice when it comes to migration and membership and citizenship. And I think this really puts into perspective some of the climate challenges, because we cannot control where we are born. So if you think of the world and you think of where you just happen to come into life on this planet, you had no control over whether you came onto the planet in a rich country with good environmental controls, with a strong economy, with good social welfare provisions, or whether you entered the world in a country that is poor, that is grappling with deforestation, desertification, whether you ended up joining the world in a place that is subject to floods or might have significant parts of your country that are going to be unable to produce sufficient food. And in the context of migration, this sort of injustice in where you actually enter means that it is hard to change places. There's a challenge of internal migration, and there is an even bigger challenge of international migration, given borders and the control over borders. And so it's for this reason that our talk today is so vitally important as we think through issues of migration and climate change. Now, we are really fortunate to have an amazing panel which brings together people from the World Bank, from academia, people who are doing on the ground work on these issues, either both as academics and as people who care about this. And we have an interdisciplinary group of individuals who are joining us. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. And I also want to just let everyone know that unfortunately, Lori Hunter, who was supposed to be on our panel, is unable to join us. Something came up for Lori, and so she really sends her regrets and had hoped to join us. So now let me tell you a little bit about the people who will be speaking today. We are first going to have Kanta Kumari Rigaud. Hello, Kanta. Kanta is a lead environmental specialist at the World Bank. She is the lead author of the bank's flagship report, Groundswell: Preparing the Internal Climate Migration, which provides key insights on the plausible scale of climate-induced migration. She is currently leading the bank's work on the Next Generation Africa Climate Business Plan, an analysis of climate-induced migration in West and East Africa. She also serves as the co-chair of the Technical Working Group on Environmental Change and Migration at, I don't know exactly how we pronounce this, but CNOMAD, which is the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. And so we're really, really delighted, Kanta, that you're able to join us and that we have such expertise to sort of set the table for us. Our second speaker is going to be Pverty Garg. Let's see if we have Pverty who can at least say hello. Pverty, are you gonna? All right, there we go, yay. With a backdrop of, I'm not sure if that's San Diego.
That's the Scripps Pier at San Diego.
Very good. So Pverty is an assistant professor of economics at UC San Diego, our friends down to the south, at the School for Global Policy and Strategy. He works on a variety of economic issues with a focus on applications to environmental problems in low and middle income countries. His current research projects include uncovering causal mechanisms that link ecosystems' health to human health and the distributional consequences of adaptation to climate change. And we want to thank you very much for joining us from San Diego today. And he will be our second speaker. Our third speaker is Elizabeth Fuzel. And Elizabeth, I'm going to apologize in advance if I got the last name, the pronunciation wrong again. It's okay, close enough. Elizabeth is, okay, thank you. Elizabeth is Associate Professor of Population Studies and Environmental Studies at Brown University and serves as the Editor-in-Chief of the Springer Journal Population and Environment. She is a sociologist and a demographer whose research focuses on the environmental dimensions of population change and migration. Her current research focuses on the long-term effects of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans residents, and she is pursuing a new project that investigates the effect of economic and environmental shocks on population change in Puerto Rico. And we're really excited to have her with us, sharing both some of the challenges of internally displaced migrants, as well as some of the sort of issues across borders, though I guess Puerto Rico is an interesting case. We'll have to talk about that. And then finally, rounding out our panel is our own Dan Kammen here at UC Berkeley. Hey, Dan. Dan is professor of energy at UC Berkeley with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, where he serves as chair, and the Goldman School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Environmental Policy. And then, just to add to his affiliations, also the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Dan is the founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, and since 1999, he has served as a contributing or a coordinating lead author on various reports on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which some of you will remember shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And so Dan is going to be concluding on our panel and sort of bringing us back in sort of full circle to some of the bigger picture issues. Okay, thank you everybody. And now without any further ado, I am going to turn over the virtual Zoom podium to Dr. Rigaud.
Good afternoon, good morning. I hope you hear me. And thank you very much for the introduction. And of course, thank you very much also for participating in this session, which I think it's a really important one. I'm going to share with you some of the work that we've been doing at the World Bank to look at this issue of climate migration. Clearly, it's an important agenda in the context of the development agenda that the bank has, which is eradicating poverty and boosting shared prosperity, which is really bringing equality to it. And we recognize from the outset that climate's a big challenge, but when you bring together the nexus of climate, migration, and development, it really takes on a different scale to ideas on the issue that we need to reflect on. But just maybe to step back a little bit, I think all of us are aware of this sort of unfolding and escalating crisis. There's not a day that goes by in the media these days that we don't hear of some displacement or some phenomena of migration. And whether it was the Pakistan floods that displaced well over 20 million, and even in the context of Europe, you begin to see events and extreme events beginning to cause mobility. And there's a lot of concern, both within the European context, but also across borders. And the IDMC, which is the International Displacement Monitoring Center, a small NGO based in Geneva, has been tracking these numbers over the years. And I think a couple of things become very clear. First is that the numbers have been on the rise. And in the latest data in 2019, you find as many as 33.4 million new displacements in each year. And if you look at the stock, it's well over 200 million. And what I think is also interesting is that the number of displacements coming out of hydrometeorological events, have been increasing. So the weather-related, the cyclones, the storms, that form almost 70% of those new displacements that we look at. But this is not to say that that's the same across the world. We know that in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, many of those displacements are conflict-related. Often the sort of reasons and the causality of why one is moving in the case of conflict is multifaceted. But there are times, of course, that it's also fueled by drought and other weather-related events, but conflicts tend to play a big part of it. Now, in looking at the whole context of climate and migration, this is just a quick snapshot. I think we are all aware we are sort of in a world that is ramping up and the emissions are going up. And under a business as usual, we could sort of follow that line on the top, reaching well over 4 degrees, as one might say, without any mitigation measures. But what that really translates to is a range of impacts that really impact people and their livelihoods and their jobs and the job insecurities, I might add. So whether it's the heat waves or the cropland decline, flooding, or water stress, you can see that the scale of impact will be so much higher. And if we're trying to reach the Paris target, we can significantly reduce that kind of impacts, but that's not where we are. I think the UNEP gap emissions report yesterday pointed out, with all the kind of commitments we have, we could, if everybody does something about it, perhaps reach about a 3 degrees, but 2 degrees seems to be out of reach for now. And that really translates into a range of impacts. And this range of impacts don't really just act in isolation. We know that there is a whole cascading nature of impacts where the forcing from the carbon CO2 emissions acts on the physical environment, but then this really has linkages into the ecological systems and the ecosystems. And when those ecosystems don't perform, whether it's the agricultural or the pastoral system, they have impacts on human beings. And that's when we're talking about impacts that could also translate into the climate migration. That was just to sort of provide a backdrop on sort of these linkages, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but I thought a good place to start. So what really prompted the World Bank to look at this issue was, obviously, we do imagine that climate is a big part of our development context, and we need a unified approach of looking at both climate and development. But as we looked at it, we really felt that there was a need to pay a little bit more attention to this human face of it. And what would it be that we needed to understand? We could see that there was an increasing number of displacements and crises that we are responding to. But at the same time, we wanted to take a longer term view of the issue and to understand what would be that unfolding scale and magnitude of it. Where would be some of those areas of greatest vulnerability, and how do we sort of really get the kind of information that can drive dialogue at the national and also at the global level. And our focus was very much on internal climate migration. I think we'll come back in the discussion, I'm sure, to a lot of bilateral, regional, and international movement. But we started with internal climate migration, partly driven by our development agenda. And we focused on the slow onset. And here, what we meant by the slow onset, so we looked at three aspects. One was we looked at the water stress factor, the drops in crop productivity, and then sea level compounded by storm surge. And we looked at it in the context of a medium-term horizon, taking it up to 2050, so that it could drive the kind of dialogue we wanted to. And we started off with what we call the scenario-based approach, looking at three different scenarios. We started off with the pessimistic, that's assuming that we continue business as usual emissions. And we use what we call the shared socioeconomic pathways that characterizes the socioeconomic development context. And SSP4 is one which is driven really by unequal development pathways. And then we developed two alternate scenarios, one that shifted to more equal development and one more climate friendly. And we brought together what we call, global data sets from the GCMs and RCPs together with the ISIMIP intercoupled crop and water simulation models. And we ran that at a 14-kilometer grid cell to see what would be the spatial population shifts that would happen as a consequence of these climate aspects. And we did calibrate the model from 1990 to 2000 to 2010. And then we looked at and compared to it where the grid cell did not have any of these additional climate elements using the gravity-based model. And we aggregated then some of these results upwards. I might add that we've actually extended this work and expanded it to have various additional elements, included a fourth scenario, and done things at more granular levels, but that's another research piece. But what we did find for the three regions that we did model was we got about 143 million people that could be moving internally. And Africa obviously was the most vulnerable, with the most projected number of people who could be moving under the pessimistic scenario, followed by South Asia and Latin America. And within these regions that we did, we also looked at sub-regions. We looked at East Africa as a sub-region. We looked at Central America. In Central America, we looked at Mexico and Central America, and South Asia in its totality. So these patterns prevailed even at that sub-regional level. But what you can see, I think, is that, with the scenarios, as you go to inclusive and more climate friendly, of course, there's bands of uncertainty, but the numbers go down. And that, you could reduce those scales, assuming that you could get to those scenarios. But the other point, I think, is about the trajectory. We are sort of really at the start of what we could see unfolding unless we change some of the ways in which we pursue our development pathways and also other processes in sort of the support systems. And so that window of opportunities is really shrinking upon us as we move forward. But the second part, I think, which is really interesting is the spatial dimension. And you can see two panels here, 2030 on the left and 2050. And what we found is that, you would have areas of climate in migration, which were areas which were more attractive and, had more opportunities in terms of the viability of crops and availability of water, versus those where people would move out because of those stresses we talked about. And what you found is that the scale, intensity, and spread of this climate in and out migration hotspots would increase over time. And so this really, I think, draws attention to the spatial dimension, the need to anticipate and begin to plan and plan differently. I think it's something we should come back to. But we also wanted to underscore that this 143 million shouldn't just be seen as a big number, that we did, go and ground truth and contextualize our findings into past migration pathways in country, based it on the literature and contextualize it, and even interviewed people, and everybody has a different story. And clearly, we need to look at much more differentiated approaches in the way we handle it. But within the sort of broader studies, we also zoned in on a few case studies. And one of the case studies we looked at was Bangladesh. And we all know that Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. And so what you find here, not surprisingly, is the movement away from the coastal areas. And at a 1 meter sea level, you're going to lose 4% of the land area on the deltaic front. And at 2 meters, you lose 8%. But you can already begin to witness a lot of the movement away from the coastal areas. And when we matched it with some of the land use in the livelihood zones, you can see that those rice growing areas were going to be out migration areas. But one other metric on the bottom left that we did isolate out was the normal climate, the normal development migrants versus the climate induced migrants. And Bangladesh was one of the countries where you find that slowly over time, certainly by 2050, the number of climate migrants would outpace the normal economic migrants. And again, this really means that the way we need to look at it, we need to plan it, and we need to consider the impacts and the drivers of push and pull really are different in different countries, and the pathways are also different. So I think just, the point we were trying to really demonstrate was the potency of climate to drive that migration. Of course, at an individual level, we know there are multiple reasons why someone is moving, but the potency of climate change through its climate variability and extremes and the trend that we are seeing, that magnitude and that intensity is going to play out in terms of the number of climate migrants. And it's always the poor and the vulnerable areas, because of the lack of options, that will be the hardest hit. The other point I think perhaps worth noting, that these are conservative estimates. We've only looked at the slow onsets. We haven't looked at the rapid onsets and the displacements. And but at the same time, we do emphasize that these are not cast in stone, because we've looked at those plausible SSP scenarios, and there are a lot of adaptive measures that could be brought in. So the main point here was really, how do we move from sort of a response to a crisis to preparedness? And while we put out 3 sort of high-level policy messages, what is clear is that we really do have to cut down the greenhouse gases, and we all know that. That really is going to make a difference to the kind of impacts that will play out and the kind of displacements one could see over time and space. But the other is, we really need to embed the resilience into the development planning. So whether it's about how do you do better adapt in place, what are the kind of social safety nets you can put in, and what are the kind of resilience measures you can take to sort of planning it over time scales as well. This is, I think, the really important point. And we do not sort of say that this is the end of it. This is really to show how we need to really invest in it. This is an iterative process of how you begin to understand and unfold these aspects. And this is some of the work that we continue to do ourselves and with partners on understanding this much, much better. But the whole point is, how do we sort of continue with the proximate responses strategies that we need, but build this into the far-sighted planning and policies within countries. Now, the policy landscape out there, I think we've all heard about this kind of various regional and global frameworks, not least the Global Compact for Migration that was concluded just over 2 years ago, the IDP, the internally displaced guidelines that exist in countries, and other frameworks. I won't go into them. But the important thing is, often at the national level, there isn't a domestication of these policies that will actually allow this kind of resilience to be built. There is some effort towards the disaster risk side, but the longer term adaptation side is still missing. So that was it. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to share those quick results with all of you.
Thank you so much, Kanta. And as we move now to our second panelist, Pverty, I just want to remind everybody in the audience that we will be letting all of our panelists speak, and then we will be moving to a question and answer period. You are free to chat in your, or not really chat, sorry, you're going to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom window. So if you just look down there, there's a Q&A button, and please just type in questions as they come to you or comments, and we will bring them all together at the very end. And now I will turn it over to our second panelist.
Thank you, Irene. And thank you, Kanta, for that very, very nice introduction and giving us a very good sense of the scope of the problem. It makes my my job a lot easier here. So picking up on what Kanta said, that there's this massive problem that is going to arise from climate migration, and the scope is going to vary quite a bit across the globe. But the key underlying factor seems to be that the poor are going to be disproportionately affected. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about why that is the case, that the poor are disproportionately affected. A lot of these reasons will be obvious, but just to show you the evidence that exists. And then second, to talk about what is one policy solution that we've been working on in terms of thinking about how we can address these changes, and then the intersection of those two issues as it relates to migration, and where a lot more work needs to be done. So I was going to spend a bunch of time talking about this, but I think the evidence was very well established by Kanta that poor people in low and middle income settings are especially vulnerable to climate change. And I'm going to broadly classify this into two categories. The first is that the poor, especially in poor regions of the world, tend to have primary occupations in agriculture, and agriculture by its nature is climate exposed, which means that climate change, even rising temperatures, which are a slightly slower moving aspect than thinking about bigger shocks like floods, are going to disproportionately affect the poor. You're going to affect their livelihoods. And the second is that what a lot of us are able to do when, say, temperatures go up, these protective measures, these defensive investments, these adaptation strategies that we have access to in the richer parts of the world may not necessarily be available. And then we're going to talk about a policy prescription that my group has been thinking about, which is social protection programs and cash transfers. So first, we've known for quite some time now that agricultural income is climate exposed. I think this has been true for very long. We've known this for a very long time, and particularly thinking about it in terms of rainfall. But perhaps some of the strongest evidence was in this paper by Schlenker, Roberts, and Smith in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which definitively showed that as temperatures exceed a critical threshold, there is a substantial decline in agricultural yields across the board. And this is a relationship for the United States, but this relationship has been found to be true in many other contexts in sub-Saharan Africa and India and Latin America, et cetera. So we well understand now that agricultural income is susceptible to rising temperatures. What is interesting about this and sad about it is that because these occupations are typically held, especially in the poorer parts of the world, by people who already face liquidity constraints, don't have enough resources to be able to invest in education, in food, in shelter and housing, et cetera. The fact that climate change is going to further compromise their income means that this is not just going to be an income effect, it's going to have pretty dramatic spillovers into other aspects. We have a paper in India where we showed that when agricultural yields go down because of hotter days in a year, it actually affects the investment into children's education. It lowers test scores, school attainment, et cetera. So these effects don't just stop at income. These are going to be effects that are going to have a lot of knock-on effects simply by virtue of the place where these effects are most likely to be felt. So that's one, right? The poor have climate exposed livelihoods. As climate change happens, their livelihoods are going to be threatened. The second is that the poor are unable to self-protect. So this is a recent paper in Nature Sustainability by several folks at Berkeley, who listed out the top 10 countries and the top 10 cities that are to face population-weighted cooling degree days. And cooling degree days are a measure of how many days you need in the year you need to be turning on the air conditioner, for instance, to bring down temperatures. And of course, most of these are in developing countries. So you've got Mumbai, Delhi, Dhaka, Karachi, Manila, Kolkata. I think Tokyo is the only one that factors in here, which one wouldn't characterize as a city in a developing country. But the net result of this is that the largest share of this burden is going to be faced in low and middle income countries. And this is because, you know, when it's hot in the US, we are simply able to turn on the air conditioner, but that requires you to have be able to afford an air conditioner, live in a place with reliable electricity, and be able to pay that electricity bill. All of those are conditions that might easily be met in some parts of the developed world, but in large parts of the developing world, those are just not conditions that one can easily meet. And you can think about adaptation in all other sorts of ways in terms of how people can protect themselves from rising temperatures. So what can we do about it? Our research is suggested that actually it turns out that social protection programs can play a very important role in reducing these effects of rising temperatures. So on the left-hand side is a paper where we looked at first, why does heat affect test scores in India? And then we showed that because it's through this agricultural income mechanism, sort of the first part of why the poor are disproportionately affected, we showed that as they were exposed to a national rural employment guarantee scheme that basically guaranteed every household in rural India 100 days of paid work, the effects of these higher temperatures was substantially muted. So in fact, you started seeing, the more you had access to this program, or the longer you had access to this program, the less you were affected in terms of your livelihoods by rising temperatures. On the right-hand side is a current working paper where we look at the effect of heat on psychological factors, such as your propensity to engage in violence through homicides, for instance. So it's just an outcome that has long been talked about as a response to heat. And again, what we show is that as the Progressa program, which is one of the largest cash transfer programs in the world when it started, as that program rolled in, there was a substantial decline in the effects of heat. So again, this is more on, these are daily effects. This is the effect of heat today on my aggressive behavior today. And even in that level, we can show that this has a direct effect on reducing the effects of temperature on economic outcomes that we do care about. You can also look at the flip side of this. So India's rural employment guarantee scheme has a very interesting setup where you don't just get the program, you have to sign up for it. But it's sort of like a conditional cash transfer program in the sense that you do have to work. It's an employment guarantee scheme, but then you get paid out a minimum wage. So you do always have the opportunity, but you're only going to sign up for this program if you don't have any other option that's providing you at least a minimum wage. And what we show is that as the number of hot days in the year increase, the take up of this program also starts to increase. So the hotter it gets, the more people are signing up for this program. We have ongoing work right now in Brazil and Mexico, which also shows very similar patterns. So as it gets hotter, more and more people are signing up for these social protection programs. So how does this all play into the context of migration? You can think about increased income as being able to relax liquidity constraints. So you no longer shackled to where you are, you can invest in going into a new city. These are often expensive procedures. There's transportation costs, new housing search costs, etc. So if you have the money, you can potentially pay for that, and that could increase migration. On the other hand, by smoothing over climate shocks in a particular location, cash transfers can also reduce migration. The sum total of evidence on this is quite mixed. There are two papers in Mexico that showed that international migration from Mexico as a result of the Progressive program either increased or decreased, depending on the method that you're looking at. But either way, the effect sizes were quite small. But what's really needed here is to start to think about like how, as these natural disasters occur, how does the political economy, how do financial constraints, et cetera, shape people's migration decisions? And that, as we start to think about interventions, whether those are in the form of physical infrastructure that reduces exposure in a particular location, or we're thinking about that in terms of income enhancements, what that's going to do for for climate migration. So just to give you an example, and I'm not saying there's evidence for this, I think this is the sort of work that we need to do, but one can imagine that if cash transfers do reduce climate migration by allowing people to defend themselves from climate shocks in particular regions, there may be a political economy argument to be made to provide transfers from one part of the world to the other where these effects are being experienced. And it could be justified on the grounds of that this would reduce inward migration, which certain communities in the world don't necessarily respond in a positive manner to climate refugees. So that's one way, that's one possible way we could start to think about this. Of course, there's a lot more work to be done here, and I look forward to hearing everybody else's thoughts on that. So thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We are now going to turn to Beth. And again, I want to remind people that if you have a comment or a question, don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom. And Beth, I'm just going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Pverty and Kanta, for taking us on a world tour. And I'm going to bring us back a little bit closer to the US, where most of my research has taken place. I'm also a migration scholar. I'm a sociologist and demographer. And so I think a lot about migration. And I want to remind us that when we think about climate migration, often we're thinking about these really dire situations where people are forced to move for really unpleasant reasons. But we forget that migration is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, most of us change residences and migrate multiple times during our lives. And so I want to shift our perspective on climate migration to think about migration as a routine planned event. And then we can return to thinking about how the environment could be informing our mobility under conditions of the climate emergency. So we move during our lifetimes for multiple reasons, including leaving our parents' homes to attend a school or get a new job or to marry and start a family. Then we move again when our households grow or decrease in size and we change jobs or retire from the labor force. And these are all planned moves that we undertake to maximize some desired goal. So how do we decide where to move when we are in the process of making the decision to move? Needless to say, environmental risk of the destination is not one of the main reasons we choose the location of our new home. People move for all sorts of reasons or move to different destinations seeking different sorts of outcomes or places where they can experience amenities or get greater urban amenities in particular. You know, urbanization is one of the global forces that has been driving migration for well over a century. And these are larger forces that translate into local decisions about where to locate businesses and housing and how to develop the infrastructure to support all of these, all of the people and businesses that are locating in these growing, often urban areas. Environmental risk may enter into these location decisions, but it's typically far down the list. Instead, in economies where insurance markets and government disaster recovery funds are in place, like in the United States, but also many other countries, higher income countries, residents feel reassured that any potential losses from a hazard event will be covered. And environmental management and hard infrastructure like levees, dams, and seawalls also reinforce this sense of security. So we don't worry too much about the environment. These systems that are in place allow people to live in risky places, and they also create a moral hazard. A moral hazard occurs when individuals benefit from increasing their exposure risk, but they do not bear the full costs of that risk. Increasingly, localities in the United States are incorporating climate resilience into their planning, which sometimes means restricting development and ceding land and neighborhoods to sea level rise. As in the case of Norfolk, Virginia, which is one of the cities that's experiencing the fastest relative sea level rise in the United States, but also in the world. In this scenario of planning for resilience, some people will need to relocate, but they do so planfully and with assistance from the government, the local or federal government, and they avoid the trauma of disaster and forced displacement. And they also minimize some of the losses that might disadvantage them. And often these people are already less advantaged members of society. But more commonly, localities act only after a disaster strikes and unplanned migrations are necessary, as in the case of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. In that situation, the least advantaged before the disaster often suffer the worst outcomes. And in this scenario, residents are forced movers and therefore move at times into places where they cannot maximize their outcomes, and they often experience tremendous trauma and loss, not just because of the disaster itself, but because when they can't move and migrate in a planful way, they aren't able to achieve those objectives that we normally achieve when we undertake migration. So how do we incorporate the environment into routine planned moves? That's the point I want to make. And it's one that we don't often think about. We don't often think about how we as individuals can be more resilient in our choice of location when we're moving. And this is because none of us are risk experts, or very few of us. We do have risk experts in maybe even in this webinar. But most of us don't have that level of knowledge that we can incorporate it fully into our migration decisions. Furthermore, the homes in environmentally risky areas may have that risk incorporated into the price of their home. In other words, they're going to be lower cost because people know that they're risky. And that is one way in which housing becomes affordable for some people who may not be able to afford living in a safer place. And this is one of the ways in which environmental injustices are created in this system. So what I'd like to suggest is that more of us, more localities, follow the lead of the most resilient cities and start thinking about how we zone risky areas for non-residential and non-business uses. The aim of this would be to planfully and incrementally incorporate risk into city and regional planning so that it's the housing and the jobs and the infrastructure that move, and therefore people will be moved out of harm's way. So this is an idea that is emerging in the discussion around climate migration. And I've been attending many, many conferences like this one or workshops like this. They just seem to be cropping up a lot. And it's great because this is exactly the kind of conversation that we need to be having in order to develop this more resilient cities, more resilient people, and maybe even a more hopeful vision of what climate migration means. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Beth. And now we will turn to our final speaker on the panel, Dan Kammen.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to all the panelists for setting this up so well for a dialogue around these topics. So what I'll do is to focus a little bit back on the migration and the displacement issues that affect some of the poorest people on the planet. And I don't need to review what was said in the excellent opening comments, but there are multiple areas where these displacements and migrations are happening from, and climate's a factor. It's not the only factor, of course, but it is increasingly a large part of that. So much so that some of the forecasts for our displacement numbers become really horrific, talking about perhaps 250 million people, in some ways, climate refugees by 2050. And we heard early comments on the situation in Bangladesh, and I just want to highlight this again because we now have million-person cities, if you will, in some of these most stressed environments, some of the least empowered people on the planet. And so essentially thinking about the types of services that we can change the situation, not to make relief camps permanent, but to make the quality of life in them better, and also to enable a far better reintroduction. And so one of the prime challenges here is that many relief camps that we often think about as transitory actually have lifespans of many decades. Often, I think 31 years is the current average lifespan. So really horrific times that people and their families can spend in these settings. And you see the mixture of geographic and environmental and water problems all rolled into one. It's something that Samira Siddiqui, a graduate student in URG, has done quite a bit of work with the Chowdhury Center on here on campus. And I want to highlight this because all of these settings really highlight the critical need to think very differently about not only basic services, but services that enable refrigeration for medicine, for food, for education, for either learning skills or building back in a variety of ways that we pay scant attention to today. In many ways, the story of these settings, and we've highlighted the Bangladesh case before, in many ways comes back to the ability to manage energy resources that enable economic activity, keeping water supplies available and potable, and providing all of the key services. And so I want to just take a kind of a look at that in terms of these displacement settings. The other part of that story, of course, is that many of the most marginalized areas are also the most critical ecologically. And while I'm not going to focus here on Brazil, one of the issues that we've seen over and over again is when you look at some of these early images to highlight deforestation, you get a central Amazonian picture, such as on the left, and then decades later, a denuded version, so much so that parts of the planet that we used to think of as the colloquial was lungs of the planet. It's a little loose definition from my physics perspective, but in terms of greenhouse gas fluxes, we are literally turning areas like this on the left into areas that used to be a sink for greenhouse gases, and also ecological resilience for humans and for wildlife, into net sources, as we see on the right here. We actually expect, sadly, that we'll be hitting one of these tipping points in the Amazon anytime soon, where roughly a quarter deforestation, it does look like forest loss will in fact generate a feedback effect with more forest loss due to lack of reduction of evapotranspiration and other features. So we often think about this in terms of the people impacted, but it's really this global story as well. And that brings me to the kind of the broader picture before I dive in on the cases, and that is the framing document for thinking about solutions. The Paris Climate Accord essentially was one where the countries of the world agreed, they haven't done it, but they agreed to cut out the pink part of the graph here, cut out about a degree of warming, led by multiple efforts by small island states, by the European nations, by the historic US-China agreement, which the US promptly reneged on and China has more or less carried on pace with. But doing these areas in the red, switching to clean energy, investing more in forest and smarter agriculture would cut off about a degree if everyone did what they said. And really only two countries, actually right now it's the Gambia and Morocco are the only two on pace. But those commitments, those NDCs, were quickly highlighted that we not only need to do what we said, but also to keep innovating, to move down these innovation curves to bring new technologies in line. One bit of good news is that only 6 months after the Paris Accord, the Kigali Accords that were focusing on industrial and refrigeration came into play. And so more or less, we think about the problem being split in half in terms of doing what we've said we'll do and then continuing to innovate. And it's both of these features which are critical in this displacement and migration part of the story as we move from the initial Paris goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees to the new goal of 1.5, recognizing we've already warmed by 1.1. So very little headroom is left. Just to put the cost numbers in perspective before I jump back into the industrializing nation context, if we look at the United States today, solar in purple and wind in green and a bit of nuclear in blue are the least cost technologies for a good chunk of the country. Natural gas in rust in Southeast and Northwest. But of course, here in California, we live in a world where it's $20 a ton is the price of carbon. And you can see there's a world where essentially gas is losing out to renewables in all settings. So why is that perspective so important to think about displacement and migration? It's because the innovations that we push largely for the affluent and the rich in terms of solar and wind power and energy storage open up very new pathways. And so while before the US election, the path we were on in terms of the global climate path was this one just about 3 degrees, 2.9 is the median number here in this blue range. But with not only the Biden administration plans, China and now Japan and South Korea all announcing zero carbon goals by roughly mid-century, we now have an optimistic scenario of this purple line getting us down to about 2 degrees. And of course, we can't even think about 1.5 until we start to make good on those things. So what's critical is that so many of the impacts of not making the low carbon pathway, the 1.5 degree reality, is that when we compare extreme heat, sea ice rise, loss of species, a whole variety of features, between 1.5 and 2 degrees, the added impact of not making that lower target, of not meeting the needs of the planet's billion people without access to basic electricity is from 2 to 10 or more times worse than if we were to make this lower pathway. So it's imperative that we invest immediately in the lowest income parts of the world, the communities who are most impacted, whose economic livelihoods are most tied to these climate change impacts. And so if we look at some of the clean energy opportunities that leverage what I just highlighted, this dramatic change in the cost and the performance of clean energy, we start to see opportunities to think very differently about relief camps. Here is one of the Rohingya relief camps where solar powered stations are making the situation safer. This is a project on the Rwanda DRC border where highly efficient cook stoves are being integrated into relief planning, largely by sort of the NGO community. The large central planning around finances has not made the large scale shift to these things yet. So I want to highlight some of the opportunities here, and I'll use a project team, a whole variety of partners. This is primarily one where Google is funding an effort here at Berkeley, and GivePower, which is Tesla's philanthropic arm, working with a company called Off Grid Box and Nuru that are providing small scale mini grids or microgrids in a whole variety of settings. It's a very sort of strong Berkeley team working in the field on these topics. And I really just want to highlight some of the examples of thinking very differently. So this is on the edge of the Virunga National Preserve in the Congo. Here we have solar being installed at ranger stations to enable communications, and some of the efforts to send text messages about rare species, about issues to enforce anti-poaching. This is an incredibly troubled area, as I think everyone in here knows. But the opportunities to think about green energy not as just a village scale option, which it is, but on a larger scale is really illustrated by this series here, where many people in the large urban centers, such as Goma, use charcoal today and transport water long distances. Well, here we have an example of a project to bring clean energy from the river systems in Congo to Goma, a city where there's $1 billion a year spent on infrastructure and energy projects in some of these most challenging settings. And this is an effort that is in fact funding Virunga National Park, funding the local communities, and providing energy resources to the largest urban center, a particularly troubled one in the area. All of these are examples of essentially finding ways to deploy those clean energy options in some of the poorest settings. I won't go through this in detail, but this is an example, although Pverty I see is spelled wrong at the top, of deploying solar on some of the slum neighborhoods, refugee communities, and selling power back to the utility after they power the local communities. And so these types of options are now available. And the one I'll sort of close out on is in Goma, in this city of 1 million people. We've now seen the first installations of large scale mini grids. And in this area, what's happening is these have been financed by the sale of so-called peace RECs, peace renewable energy credits, bought by commercial entities in the United Nations to enable the funding for clean energy projects that go into those most marginalized communities where refugees from these areas hit. So on the good side, this is raising an awareness. The UN and IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, are recognizing how much the world of clean energy has changed, both in terms of price and in fast deployability in these most challenging settings. What has not happened, however, is the large-scale funding of these efforts. So matching what we say, what we can do technically, with the ability to invest in these most challenged areas. And so I'll stop there, move into the conversation, but thank you all for participating, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I want to take this opportunity to just thank everybody on the panel for really highlighting the challenges and the scope and the scale of what sort of confronts us, but also offering ideas and pathways that we can think about moving forward, from mini energy grids to policy planning to social redistribution programs. I'm now going to invite all of our panelists to turn on their videos as we move into our Q&A. And then I'm going to also remind our audience, our virtual audience, that they are welcome to use that Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom to type in any questions they have, comments, etc. And to start us off, I'm going to direct a question to Kanta and Pverty, thinking about this nexus between climate, migration, and violence, political governance issues. And Pverty, you showed results from a paper where mitigation strategies that might have a correlation between higher temperatures and violence can somewhat be mitigated by social redistribution. And I think it raises a larger question about the circular nature of how violence can make climate challenges more acute, but then at the same time, climate challenges also aggravate political conflict and violence. And so I'd love to have both of you comment on that. And I'm just going to read out a question that we got from an audience member. So we have the comment: conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa have some root causes related to climate. Can we qualify the migrations following these climates as climate ones? I think about migration related to Mali and Lake Chad basin insurgencies. And so I guess the question I would pose to both of you is the relationship between climate migration and sort of political conflict or political violence. And maybe also as a backdrop, the fact that under UN conventions and protocols, it is only people who can claim political persecution who have a chance for refugee protections in a way that climate migrants often fail to access. And so Kanta, why don't I start with you?
Sure, no, thank you very much. Yeah, it's kind of complex, right? So we do know that climate change, acting to drought or water stresses can amplify conflicts. And at the same time, the conflicts, the underlying causes could also be. So let me give you an example. The question is coming from Africa, in Mali, Chad. And I think we think of the pastoralists, right? They are probably a community that, to Beth's point, right? Inherently, part of their lifestyle has been moving with their herds, and they move in search of water. But the pattern of movement has changed, right? Because water becomes stressed more quickly. They have to move at a different time, and they move into areas where farmers haven't harvested their crop, and then there is conflict. So it is very dynamic, right? So now you have a different type of movement and a different type of mobility and conflicts emerging. And this is why I think we need to pay attention to the kind of solutions. Those solutions are always going to be very context specific. I think to the point that Pverty was making about social protection, those are really important. And at the same time, while some of this social protection can be in place where you provide cash transfers or work for, we also are thinking about portable social safety nets where people can have access to these mechanisms even as they move to sort of diffuse some of these conflicts. So I'm not really answering, I mean, I'm just agreeing with the speaker's question that it does interact, it's complex, and there's some meta-analysis that begin to show the links between conflict and climate are stronger than what people had anticipated in trying to keep them separate before. And so I think that's the way, even from the development context, we are recognizing we need to work on both fronts of it without sort of thinking about the causality aspect sometimes.
Pverty?
Yeah, I think Kanta covered most of the things that I was going to say, which is absolutely right, which is that I think there's a lot more to be done. I think the research on cash transfers has been very, very rich. I think a lot of really cool organizations have been doing some fascinating work, the World Bank, USAID, Give Directly, et cetera. But I think that the one part of the cash transfer discussion that's not been addressed as much is that as people move, what should we be doing with in terms of the eligibility for these benefits? Are these eligibility for these benefits conditioned on being in the place where, for instance, the shock is occurring, where the disaster is occurring, or do you get to move with this? And I think that is that's a very complex question. I think there's the simpler question there is what's economically most efficient. But I think the larger question of, well, how do we, because we have to find this money somewhere, right? We have to be able to raise this money somewhere. And that's where the political economy of how do you get money raised for these issues starts to really play in. And I think there it's an open question whether like we're more likely to generate these funds if they're tied to the location of the disaster vis-a-vis elsewhere. And I think that's just, we just don't know enough in that space. And I think that's exactly why we need a multidisciplinary approach to think about that, because this is going to be, you have to talk about the raising of the finances, how they're going to be spent, what's the political acceptability of how these funds are spent, and then ultimately, like, actually, what is the impact that's happening? So I think, I don't know about the specific context of Mali and Chad. That's not an area that I've done really any work in, but I think it's certainly true that we know that the evidence on climate and violence has become really strong, and this is on 3 different dimensions. It's on intergroup conflict, so groups fighting with each other, typically through resources, but we're also seeing this in interpersonal violence, which is on a day-to-day level just because of heat stress. It's hotter, so therefore I'm more irritated, I'm more aggressive, and more likely to engage in violent acts. And we see this on like how hot it is today has a direct effect on the likelihood of homicides occurring on that very day. So this isn't through necessarily an income channel. And now we're also seeing evidence on the intrapersonal violence, which is on self-harm. And there again, you are noticing this evidence. So on all 3 levels of violence, we're seeing quite convincing evidence that rising temperatures are linked in there.
Thank you. That's very disconcerting, but important to know. I want to now ask a question of both Beth and Dan, pulling on sort of comments that you both made in terms of changing sort of residential patterns in a way. And so Beth, you pointed out potentially the necessity of having floodplains and making sure that housing wasn't built there, or sort of moving people from that. And Dan, those pictures that you showed obviously of the Amazon really shows the destruction of forests when people move in. And I'm wondering if both of you could comment a little bit on this possible tension between protecting the environment in terms of having floodplains, protecting, conserving land, making sure that you have these green lungs versus the challenges of housing, urbanization, and potentially the need to go to more dense locations so that we can reduce carbon footprints to the extent that, smart city planning might actually help us reduce use of, cars, commuting, et cetera, public transport, and so forth. So what do you think in terms of this trade-off, or maybe it's not a trade-off, but between protecting land, floodplains, green spaces and such, and some of the climate mitigation? Beth, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, well, I'm going to speak mostly about what I've learned in the United States. And I think that when we think about housing and the way we've been building housing in the United States for the past, century, we've really focused on single family homes, the sort of, ideal home with a yard, and the bigger the better, it seems, in recent years. The sort of McMansions are just sprawling now. And I think that is a way, it's just an unsustainable way of housing the population, and it has implications for the environment. So clearly, but I think it gets back to the point that I was making about zoning and how localities can decide, kind of zoning they'll allow and what the priorities are. And if they increase sort of climate resiliency, not just moving away from risk, but also creating higher density housing in areas that could have plenty of amenities, even natural amenities, but make them more of a collective good than a privatized good, we could have much more sustainable cities, house as many people, maybe house them better. But it's the problem right now is that so many of the neighborhoods are actually zoned so that the only kind of house you can build is a single family home on a single lot. And that's just something that is a 20th century ideal that we have to let go of.
Dan?
So I don't really see these as a sort of a conflict or an either or. I mean, many of the areas that you described, the floodplains, the areas that are critical for ecological function, certainly do have populations in them, but they're not in general massively high density. Bangladesh is an interesting exception to this in some ways, but in terms of the ecological resilience that we get, and it's not just in terms of floods, it's actually things like COVID. We've already seen a whole variety of disease things are exacerbated by destroying the ecological diversity in the system. So those areas where these kind of more decentralized remote solutions I highlighted, microgrids, these smaller scale technologies, they play a large role in terms of empowering women, in terms of enabling a better management of the near ecological zones. But the question that you sort of asked about the larger story of carbon footprint and densification is actually something I just dropped it into the Q&A box, because that's a big topic of work where we've a wide range of evidence that indicates that with better technology, with better policies, we can not only densify our urban areas, but we can actually dramatically improve air quality, quality of services, water quality, as opposed to what was really the trend of the last century, which was greater urban densification, but poorer and poorer quality services, in particular for low-income people. And we've seen a whole variety of versions of this. Decentralized solar allows us to build that into not only big solar farms in deserts, but rooftops of buildings, glass that's made of solar panels so that they serve the function of a window, but they generate energy. They can be integrated into high and now low income homes because the costs are so low. The ability to do many of our government services in terms of e-services is not just kind of an affluent country model. We already have seen that the advent of electronic on your phone banking in East Africa, it goes by the name M-Pesa as the version. We've already seen a 2% rise in income through the use of mobile, low transaction cost money, and it's a service that absolutely removes a lot of the barriers to banking, which primarily, of course, block access for women and minorities and low-income people. So there's a whole range of these things that allow the urban spaces that we need to be cleaner and to be better service, better servicing. One example, of course, is moving to better mass transit, but where we do have individual vehicles, electric vehicles remove all of the pollution associated with the energy that goes in that vehicle to other sites. And so the ability to think dramatically different about cities is one of the things that actually happened at Paris. Mayor Anne Hidalgo chaired the biggest collection of mayors around the world at that same Paris climate conference to highlight all of these sorts of solutions. And I think that only if we look at the mixture of how do we serve low-income people better, but how do we make urban cores anywhere in the world more livable, only there do you get really a way to kind of be on that lower curve I mentioned, that 2.1 degree, the kind of the more optimistic path, if we now really begin to invest in these areas more seriously.
Thank you, Dan. Here's a question for anyone on the panel, really. We have a question from Mary Steiner about how the UN Sustainable Development Goals might mitigate displacement. And I guess I would ask the more general question. Dan raised a lot of technological responses that's going to help maybe reduce the heating of the planet in terms of the windows, creating solar electricity. But to what extent does technological solutions need to be paired with political solutions? And especially, there's this distinction between trying to do micro-oriented projects that many of you highlighted versus sort of global responses in terms of the Paris Climate Accords, the Migration Compact, UN, UN pacts and conventions and such. So I would love to hear a little bit about sort of technological responses versus political responses, especially at the most global scales. And I think, Dan, you wanted to comment on Mary's question. So why don't we start with you and then I'll open it to other panelists.
Well, I just went, but I think I'll just say really briefly that I think we've learned a lesson over the past decades or centuries that technology only gives us a lever. And that if this isn't run through a social and a policy lens, we will likely invest in things that make life better for the already rich. And so this is really a story of, do we take all of these tools and utilize them in the ways that we're talking about in terms of the most vulnerable and the people who could contribute most to society, but in fact are often just trying to eke out a living. And if we think about this as technology first, I think we fail before we begin. The real story here is these are enablers, but that's all they are.
Other panelists, just raise your hand if you want to.
Okay,
yes.
Let me come in here. I mean, I think pairing a few different questions about the SDGs, and I think to some of the comments that Dan has been making. I work in the Africa region, and of course, we all know that Africa is not just impoverished, but trying to get out, and it's really being challenged by climate, amongst other challenges. And the way we're looking at it is clearly it really has to helps to become more resilient, whether it's the agriculture, whether it's the natural resources, their buildings, their energy, their infrastructure. But energy, and I want to challenge then, I mean, energy is really the most important. It is, 500 million, 50% of the population doesn't have access to energy. And those statistics, 500 million, imagine today, that don't even have energy. And we're arguing that energy is the critical enabler of resilience. And, if you don't have that, then you really get impoverished faster. And even if you're talking about migration, it happens when you can't eke out a livelihood, you have no diversification, your schools don't work, your hospitals are not there. And it really aggravates the whole thing. So we do see energy as a critical. And I think the technical and technology solutions are there, but they're not there at the scale that is required. And if we continue at the current pace, in 2050, we'll still have 500 million people because of the population increase. So the challenge is, yes, Africa needs technology, they need capacity, they need financing. But if we don't help Africa, you will have a carbon footprint that will be much larger, all things being equal. And so we really do need some kind of a political breakthrough to support them to get more resilient, to get the energy access, and therefore even probably reduce some of this distress-driven migration that everybody's so worried about, flooding into the northern parts. So, you know, how do we foster that breakthrough in terms, it's a win-win. Africa will be better off, the global community will be better off, and at different levels. So I think that's really what we're trying to pursue under the Africa Business Plan. And of course, everybody's thinking along the same lines, but we do need that kind of a breakthrough at scale and driven by that kind of a change, as opposed to just project level changes, which won't get us there.
Beth or Pverty, do you want to weigh on this or no? Good. All right, we'll move on to another question. This is, I don't know if it follows from Kanta's question or statements, but Leora is asking in terms of incorporating population growth in this relationship between climate and migration, whether there is a resource strain or what sort of happens with the redistribution of population if people are moving from low carbon use economies to very high use economies. So we could imagine, you know, forced migration flows or just other flows from lower, you know, HDI countries to higher HDI countries. Do we find that we actually increase our carbon footprint as people move from those low carbon use economies? And this is an open question for anyone on the panel.
I mean, I'll jump in a bit, but I feel like I'm going too often. I mean, I would say that this is a critical question for which we actually have interesting tools in place. We clearly need to think through the life cycle impact of not only our energy choices, but our food, the food miles. All of these things are quantifiable, and there's some reasonable efforts. In California, we have a low carbon fuel standard to think through the impact of moving, for example, from liquid fuels, whether they're fossil or bio, to electricity. There's efforts that have been put out, like the Good Guide, to understand the pharmaceuticals, the pesticides that go into things we consume. But we're not particularly science literate. And the United States is, of course, demonstrating how illiterate you can be in this area. But building these resources in allows us to think very differently about those questions. And so inherently moving from a poor country to a rich country, especially if you're an affluent person moving from a poor country to a rich country, your carbon footprint actually doesn't often get worse. But we're going to have to decarbonize our societies dramatically now. And we're now on the order of, you know, sort of a generation, 2 decades, to completely turn over our energy system, to invest in smart farming, to reinvest in forests. Those are issues for which these technical tools are great, but it will have to be, you know, led by the kind of political leadership that Pverty talked about and Kanta talked about in terms of investing in the country. So I really think that recognizing our tools just sets us up for a conversation that we're avoiding so far.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this, Beth?
Yeah, I would just add that I think the amount of international migration from the global south to the global north is relatively small compared to all of the other things that are going on that would increase the carbon footprint of nations. And so I wouldn't look at migration as like a first reason for increasing carbon use.
Thank you. Or I guess conversely, as seeing closing borders as a way to solve the environmental problem. We have someone in our audience who is curious about the Middle East and North African region. And, you know, comments that at least on our panel's expertise, the focus has been on regions other than the MENA area. And the question is, I am also curious to hear a reflection on why MENA did not appear in any speakers' comments today. Is there a reason why the MENA region is overlooked in surveys and overviews, despite the challenges that the region faces with conflict, migration, and climate change? So if anybody has done research or would like to comment on the challenges in the Middle East and North Africa. Open question.
Just a quick comment, Irene. I think the research that I shared that focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, we are actually doing a second report right now that is focusing on the Middle East, North Africa, on East Asia. That report will be out in springtime next year. I might add that the Middle East, North Africa is a little bit more challenging. We can't apply the model, at least not in the Middle East, and we're doing it in a more qualitative way. But yes, we are looking at the issues.
Kanta, you were coming in and out a little bit, but if I understood correctly, there is a new report coming out which will be focusing on that region. And while the issues are quite complex, we should pay attention, and we'll be seeing something that shines a spotlight there shortly. Dan, did you also want to speak about the MENA region?
Sure, happy to. So I mentioned only very briefly what Morocco has done. And actually, Morocco is the largest economy in the world that is on pace to meet their climate targets, largely by investing in large-scale solar and wind, given their exceptional resources. But it was something where policy-led, the king and a team put together a plan, and they implemented it with work at the World Bank and their own funding and some European funders. So there is interesting action in the region. And in fact, one of the really sad cases, I would say, is the violence we're now seeing in Ethiopia. The challenges in Sudan and South Sudan are very much tied to battles over fossil fuel resources mixed in with ethnic and other politics. And these are regions where you could see very large migrations. We're already seeing those in border areas, but investing in the sort of infrastructure that I just briefly described is one of the ways. And so we have a project in South Sudan that kind of fits the model. Very large relief camps in some of the areas of conflict at the border, but an effort using these peace renewable energy credits to get international funders to support a large-scale solar array that today is now up and running, and it powers the relief camp. But it is designed in a way that as people move back into the town, this is in Malakal in northern South Sudan, Malakal would now be powered by a large solar array plus a low-cost battery system, which the UN is paying for now because they need it to run this massive relief camp. But it is essentially a drop-in solution for a clean energy technology for the city. And so, this is very much a technology developed for the MENA region, and actually the OPEC oil fund is part of the investors in this effort. And we're seeing discussions around this in a number of MENA nations. So it definitely is a suitable solution, but it raises one last interesting question, and that is, almost all the development of solar cells, for example, is really designed for temperate northern latitudes. In West Africa with the Harmattan winds, and in the Middle East, you get a large amount of dust. That dust anneals or melts onto solar panels, and it can reduce output by 40% because you can't just wash it off. So there is a lack of innovation to meet the needs of regions that weren't part of the first investment wave. So now we're seeing a company in Jordan, another one in Morocco, but it's a classic example of an entirely solvable technical problem that we underinvest in because these aren't the communities that have the resources now to be on the cutting edge of that R&D spectrum.
Thank you, Dan. All right, we're running out of time. And so I would like to ask as sort of a wrap up to what's really been a fascinating discussion. I'm going to ask each panelist in the order that they first presented to sort of highlight the one issue that they would personally like to see either more research about. So for all of those students who are listening in or people who want a new research project. So what would be the one thing that you would like to see more research, or for those who are listening in who want to focus their advocacy on a particular issue, what is the one issue that you would ask them to focus their advocacy around? So either research or advocacy, but what's the one thing that you would want the audience to really focus on moving forwards? And so again, we'll do it the order that people spoke. So Kanta, you get to go first.
I guess just, the message is, I think one shouldn't be having such a negative connotation about that's really important. You know, when we are labor migrants and successful, I think we move around, but the migration that concerns me is the distress-driven one, that we really need to look at the underlying causes and address those, because I think those are very much driven by poverty and lack of options, and we really need to address it. But I think it's sort of not to be fearful that it's not a negative thing. I think we need to address the underlying causes. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Pverty.
Yeah, I think I would say that we're seeing a lot of research on the effects of climate change, and we're seeing a lot of research on the impact of social protection programs, but we're seeing very little at the intersection of those two. And I think thinking about, I think both of those are a given reality. Like, I think a lot of countries are expanding their scope, especially during COVID. There's been a massive expansion of social protection. The climate change effects are not going anywhere. And I think thinking about how those two institutions are going to interact, in what context particularly they're going to deliver the best win-win solutions, I think is really important.
Thank you, Beth.
I really appreciate what Pverty just said about how there are these two things. There's, you know, the sort of normal way in which society operates, where there's a tremendous amount of inequality and particularly poverty that is just, that needs to be remedied, that there need to be solutions for those routine social problems that we tend to just sort of maybe ignore when we're thinking about the climate crisis, because we think of the climate emergency as this separate thing that's that needs to be addressed with separate policies, and the two really intersect in a way where climate change shines a lens on social inequality in a way that it's not separate from the way society works. And so I guess what I would say is, you know, I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to say keep studying social problems, try to understand the mechanisms through which climate makes these social problems worse, and then, but that ultimately we need to solve the social problems that make people vulnerable.
Thank you. Dan.
So I guess I'll do the opposite of what Beth did. And that is, I probably have, as a physicist, I have economist envy. Because, and physicists don't say that very often. So, I mean, for me, it's actually financial reform, because we already know that our financial institutions discriminate against minorities, discriminate against women. We use FICO scores to keep people of color from renting or buying homes. At the same time, we subsidize fossil fuels to the tune of $5 trillion a year worldwide, which means that we prevent the investments in these areas just by our lock into a financial system, which is used to small upfront costs and not financing the things we want. No social cost of carbon, no interest to understand or recognize the externalities. And so many of those play out for the poor first. For me, it would really be market and financial reform over essentially everything else, because I think we have the tool set on the hardware side. I just don't think we're willing to financially or mentally divest from our old ways.
Well, I have to say, as a sociologist and a social scientist, I'm excited that one of the endpoints of this conversation is we have to better understand inequality and equities and some of these issues, rather than look for the technical and, you know, think about financial systems and such. I want to thank each of our panelists so much for their time, the care with which they shared their insights and their knowledge with us. And then thank you to everybody who participated in this webinar and who took time at the end of a very long semester and a very long 2020 to join us in this absolutely critical conversation. On behalf of myself, Faculty Director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, and on behalf of Matrix and our partners such as SIGA, we thank you all for joining us in this conversation. Stay well, stay safe, and we wish you all the best for what remains in 2020. Thank you, everybody.